This video will introduce water management and the difference between percolation and infiltration. If it's been a while since you reviewed soils, I recommend looking at soil texture, structure, and soil water before you approach this chapter. Water is probably the number one factor that determines whether a plant is going to succeed or fail. If you have a tree growing in its natural habitat, chances are that the normal rainfall patterns are going to be enough to sustain that tree. But there will still be years where it's more dry or more wet than usual. You'll need to know what that plant needs to make up for it. Unless you're working strictly in a natural area, the landscapes that you're going to work in will have ornamental trees that come from different parts of the country or different parts of the world. So it's important for you to know where that particular tree came from and what are the normal water patterns in that area. How much water does it get? When does it get it? The goal is to match your management to the conditions that that tree had wherever it originated. Irrigation is really helpful because you can bring in as much water as you need, but also has challenges. The irrigation system has to function properly at all times, or you risk having a tree become drought stressed. Irrigation water also has more salts and dissolved substances compared to rain, which may be a problem for sensitive trees. Then you'll have to manage salinity. The reason why water is so important is because plants need it to maintain almost all of their processes. It's also really tricky because a plant can have the same symptoms if it has too much water or too little water. When the plant has too little water, the leaves will wilt, turn yellow, fall off, or they can even get sunburned because the water helps cool them off. Sections of a tree can also die because there isn't enough water to support the entire canopy. On the flip side, if you have too much water in the soil, the roots can rot or the pores in the soil will be filled with water, so there's no oxygen. The symptoms can be the same as too little water because the root system will be smaller after root rot and it won't be able to take up as much water as before. And if it's not getting oxygen, it can't perform as well as it used to. To make it even more complicated, there's other problems like girdling roots or vascular diseases that create the same symptoms. In general, when you're approaching a tree with a problem, make sure you consider the watering first so that you can determine whether it's part of the problem. Now, let's discuss infiltration and percolation. Infiltration is the process of water entering the soil. The infiltration rate will vary depending on the type of soil and what's covering the surface. A soil that has coarser particles, like a sandy soil, lets water through a lot more quickly, so it will have a faster infiltration rate, whereas a soil with fine texture, like a clay soil, will have a slower infiltration rate. If the soil is bare on the surface, it may form a crust as irrigation water and rain droplets splash on the surface. The splashing kicks up the smallest particles and they can settle back on the surface and start plugging it up. If you have a landscape with some sort of a plant cover or turf grass or mulch, generally the infiltration rate is higher because that soil structure is protected. It's a good idea to test infiltration rate when you're adjusting your irrigation to make sure you're not overwhelming the landscape with more water than it can take in. If the irrigation rate is higher than the infiltration rate, you'll get runoff. If you want to improve the infiltration rate on your soil, put down some kind of ground covering to protect the surface and do whatever you can to improve the soil structure. Percolation is what follows right after infiltration. It's the rate of water moving through the soil. A soil with a coarser texture and a better aggregated soil will also have a faster percolation rate. With finer textured soils like clay, not only do they have smaller pores, but those small particles tend to attract and hold water more tightly. The soil pores may need to be completely saturated before gravity kicks in and pulls that water downwards. These are important concepts to know if you're working in developed areas where there's some degree of disturbance and new topsoil may be brought in. When you have a difference in texture between those layers, that can inhibit the movement of water down the soil. It's worse if the layer that's brought in has a finer texture than the original soil, because that fine soil again has to be completely saturated before the water will drain down under gravity. So at the boundary between the fine soil above and the coarser textured soil below, you will have a zone of saturation that's going to block root growth, block oxygen, and rot roots. This texture difference will come into play in other ways too. There's a big misconception out there that you should put gravel at the bottom of a planting pot or into a planting hole before you put in the tree. The idea is to improve drainage, but it has opposite effect. The gravel is a coarser layer on the bottom, and the root ball is a finer layer on top. That root ball has to become saturated at the bottom before the water will move into the gravel. So the bottom of the root ball is more likely to get root rot. Since part of the hole or the pot is now filled by gravel, the root ball will actually become saturated earlier than if it was the same soil. There's usually already a texture difference between the potting soil that plants are grown in and your native soil, so there's no reason to make it worse by adding gravel.